A few weeks ago, before this event, I had the opportunity to sit down with the chief data reporter at Financial Times, John Murdoch. If you have seen any of the coronavirus trajectory or trackers charts by the Financial Times in the past 2 years, he is the person who created them. And when, as he puts it, pandemics are not happening, John uses data and graphics to tell stories on topics including politics, economics, climate change, and sports, and is a senior visiting fellow at the London School of Economics Data Science Institute. This is just a brief preview of our conversation. We'll be sharing the full recording in follow-ups for this event. Let's listen in.
Thanks, Stella, and thanks for having me at the event. It's a real privilege to be able to speak to everyone today. So I'm just going to share with you an initial presentation, which essentially captures the core principles of how I approach data visualization and how we at the Financial Times approach this area more broadly. The focus today, sort of building on what you folks have been doing at Ataccama, is on really getting into the idea that with data visualization, we're telling stories. We're not just putting out sort of individual isolated charts. We're actually creating an overarching narrative that can be much more effective than doing single charts here and there. So what I want to start with is the fundamental way that I and we at the FT think about this is that if you're going to create effective charts, you really need to know how people consume charts. People really consume charts like they're watching a movie or like they're watching television. They're trying to get a message away, and they're not focusing on the individual details so much as the overall bit of communication, the overall message that a chart delivers. And so the way I think about things is you can improve any chart by making these, shall we say, incremental decisions around exactly what chart type am I using, how precisely am I encoding the data in this chart, how am I tweaking the design to make it a little bit more engaging, more attractive. And that will improve the chart slightly. It will take the chart you started with and make it better. But to really massively multiply the impact that your chart has, it's about focusing on the message that chart is conveying, really what you're fundamentally trying to say in any given graphic. And so again, I think a lot of the resources, a lot of the tutorials are focused on these incremental improvements you can make to charts. And I think that's fantastic. And, we all want to know how we can make our charts better. But I think we miss the wood for the trees sometimes. We focus so much on those small incremental changes and not on the fundamental difference between most good charts and most bad charts, which is what they're actually saying and how clearly they're saying it. So data visualization fundamentally is a communication skill. I know, look, a lot of people think about this as almost more of an art area or possibly slightly more mathematical. Some people approach data visualization because they want to make beautiful things. Some people approach data visualization because they want to solve mathematical problems and work on geometry and that kind of thing. But for me, those two things are fantastic. But if we want our work to be worthwhile, we've got to think about it as a communication skill. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this now in action in our work at the Financial Times, and what I mean by this absolute sort of laser sharp focus on communication and on text and on messaging. So taking this idea that good words are the key to good graphics on board, probably the most sort of iconic, you might say, example of our work at the FT over the last 2 years was our work on what we called the coronavirus trajectory tracker. So this was a graphic that first I made the first rough version of in early March 2020, where we wanted to answer this question of how many cases have there been, how many COVID cases have there been in different countries around the world, and to what extent are these different countries following in the footsteps of Italy, which at that time was known to be having a very, very bad pandemic. This is the very first rough version of that graph that I made in response to a colleague's email. You can see this obviously isn't something we would have published on the FT, but this was just a proof of concept showing that if we showed this on the x-axis, this on the y-axis, and these countries, that this was going to get across the point we want to make. But the question is, okay, how do we go from here to the final chart that we published on the FT, and the chart that ended up really kickstarting the work that we did on the pandemic over the following 2 years. And this is a chart whose final version ended up being seen by tens of millions of people. So again, coming back to my previous point about the incremental improvements on a chart versus the sort of multiplicative improvements, the first thing we did, of course, was just to style it up, to turn this into a graphic that looks like it could be published on the FT. So we've got our iconic colored background there. We've got our own fonts and our colors, the colors of the countries, and we've tidied it all up a bit. So this is good. Like this is a more aesthetically pleasing chart than the one we had before. But at this point, I still think this is not a million miles away from lots of charts that people were doing at this time. It shows the same data, it shows the same axes. It's not vastly different. So the real value adds that we introduce at the FT is this text layer, this annotation layer. So we've now got a very clear narrative title on this chart, which tells you exactly what you should be taking away from this. And we've also got these annotations coming in to answer some of the questions that might pop into a reader or a viewer's head when they see this chart. So the title means that even if someone has never seen a chart before, even if they've never seen a line chart like this, they've never seen a chart showing this type of information, they know what the chart is trying to tell them. So for those who are familiar with charts, that's just a big addition, a big extra help in terms of telling them what to take away from this. But for those who haven't seen these charts before, it's essentially an entry point. They can read that title, then look at the chart and start to work out how the title relates to the chart. It's essentially teaching someone how to read a chart in the process of showing them a chart. And the great thing that we experienced over the last couple of years was we really saw this actually happening in real time. You know, there were old school friends of mine who I've not spoken to for like 15 years, and they were getting in touch with me and saying that their mum had just shared this chart with them on WhatsApp and that kind of thing. And it was really, from everything we could tell, it was really about that focus on text to bring in the sort of non-chart people to the idea of understanding and communicating in charts. Another technique we talk about at the FT is this idea of visual rhetoric. So rhetoric, being rhetorical, this is about focusing on how you say something and how you can introduce more emotion, more sentiment, and make your statements more powerful by thinking about how you say them. And I think we can do exactly the same thing with charts. So this is an example of that in action. This was from last year after the US had pulled out of Afghanistan and the Taliban were returning to take control of the country. And one of the big questions that everyone had was, what will this mean for girls' education in Afghanistan? Because of course, when the Taliban had previously been in power, girls had been essentially banned from attending school. And so instead of just asking that question, we thought, how can we do this in chart form? And you'll see that we've got this, it's a sort of classic data visualization archetype. You've got a change over time, a sudden change over time, a break in a series. And so a couple of the flourishes we've added here. So one is the fact that we switched the line from blue to red when the Taliban were in power to try and encode the fact that something negative was happening. We've got that line sort of fading from blue into red. We've got the highlighting of the Taliban being in power. And then on the right-hand side, we explicitly asked that question. We put that question mark there saying, okay, so what happens next? And so this just becomes a much more sort of holistic way of showing this than a simple line chart where we have no question mark, no changes in color, that kind of thing. So I think it's really valuable to just think about those small additions you can make, which really turn this from being a quite sterile chart into something that has real emotional power. Another thing we can do is to think of charts almost as frames in a sequence, almost as frames in an animation. So you're showing someone the evolution of something over time. I always come back to change over time. I think it's one of the most effective ways of communicating things through data visualization. So this is another example from a recent piece of Financial Times work, looking at how the geography of footballing power, or soccer for those in countries who use that term, looking at how that has shifted over the last 75 years. So a very different topic to coronavirus, but as Della was saying earlier, we do cover a lot of different topics at the FT. And so what we wanted to do here was say, today, or for the last 20 years, everyone who follows football, who follows soccer, has been very familiar with the idea that all the talent is concentrated in the west of the continent, but that's not always been the case. And so this is a graphic showing where the strongest football teams in Europe have been geographically located over time. And again, I think the power here is, instead of just saying, well, here's where they were before, or here's where they are now, we can actually show that gradually changing over time. So 75 years ago, most of the talent was concentrated around Vienna and Budapest, and the epicenter of European footballing power which is that black X mark, is sort of in Central Europe. But if we move forward by 35 years, we see the quality of the clubs and that sort of footballing epicenter shift across towards the west and slightly further south as talent started to grow in the south. And then if we shift that through again to the very latest data, we see it shift even further west as the amount of money and talent in the game shifts further west. But the point is, trying to show all of that in a single graphic would be very ambitious. I think you would lose that idea of movement. Whereas by showing this as three distinct frames, you're bringing the person along with you. I think, again, this is really about thinking about accessibility and approachability of your work. A single graphic that tried to convey all of this would rely on your audience knowing how to read these types of charts. Whereas if you walk them through, talk them through, and demonstrate step 1, step 2, step 3, they can actually see the physical movement, which is what you would have been trying to convey in a static single chart. And finally, I just want to go through probably the sort of most iconic example of this storytelling change over time technique that we've used at the Financial Times in the last couple of years. And this was another COVID chart where about 12 months ago, or just over 12 months ago, the big question everyone was asking in the UK was, okay, look, we're seeing large numbers of people getting severely ill with COVID this winter, but is it not the case that there are always large numbers of people getting ill with viruses over winter, with things like the flu and pneumonia? And so the question was, okay, first of all, can we answer that question? But secondly, what's the most powerful way of us telling that story? And this is where, again, my first thought went immediately to the idea of building something up with frames, with animation, and thinking, okay, instead of just showing on a single chart what the total number of people severely ill with COVID looks like now compared to what it would be with flu, let's see if we can actually create this sense of expectation, show people repeatedly what a normal winter looks like in terms of respiratory disease, and then jump in with what it now looks like with COVID. And this was the result of that. So we see, here's what the total number of people being admitted to ICU with flu looks like in a typical year. We go through several years to give this idea of here's what normal looks like, here's what we would expect to happen. And we then get to 2020, 2021, in comes COVID, and it shatters that expectation. I'll let this loop again, but the idea here is that instead of simply showing the end result in the first place, by spending a few seconds literally demonstrating to someone through shape, through space, through movement, that this is what normal looks like, this is what we would expect to happen, and then having the big impact, the big visual and emotional impact of saying, here's how that's changed, you create a far more effective piece of work and something that will stay with people for much longer. And again, whether this is portrayed as an animation or as a series of charts, it's this focus on telling a story, of crafting a message, and of essentially influencing the viewer's emotional response that I think is critical to how we've always worked with charts at the Financial Times.